Hello everyone, this is a panel about game dev and academia. We are at Houdini B and we'll be monitoring the chat, so if you have any question, please write big question in caps, so it will not be missed. And so let's start the panel. Let me introduce my co-discutants, Clara Fernandez-Vara, Erin Read, and Biswas. And it's a pleasure to meet you, and I hope it will be a great discussion. So if you could introduce yourselves to the public, and then let's go and discuss. So who wants to go?
I can start. So I'm Clara Fernandez-Vara. I'm an associate arts professor at NYU, and I've been teaching game development and design for like 13 years, more, almost 14, a long time. And I also work in the industry as a narrative designer and consultant. So do a bit of both, teaching, mostly I'm more of the academic than in the industry, but I do both.
Cool, I can jump in. I'm Erin Read. I did a PhD focusing on interactive storytelling at UC Santa Cruz and taught some classes there while I was there. The last few years I've mostly been out of academia, but I have kept my foot in a bit. I co-authored a book called Adventure Games Playing the Outsider that came out last year. It was academic book with Bloomsbury, and then this year I've been working on a blog series called 50 Years of Text Games. That's kind of deep dives into the history of interactive fiction. So
I'm Sharang Biswas. Currently I'm an adjunct professor at Fordham University in the Department of Computer Science, teaching video game design. I'm also a visiting teaching fellow at BARD at the the International Center of Photography, teaching game design, except that MFA got paused during the pandemic, so I didn't teach that this year, and I don't know what's going to happen with that. I've only been teaching at the university level for the last couple of years, so 2-3 years. I've been teaching non-university level before that. I am a freelance analog games person, and I actually do more of that than I do teaching, so kind of like the opposite of Clara. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm Artur Ganshiniec. I'm a video game designer stationed in Poland. I worked on the first games from the Witcher series, and now I write interactive fiction. But apart from that, I cooperate with some Polish universities, and I've been teaching game design and story design for the last 12 years, and introduction to game design. I'm not an academic, more from the practical field, but especially in Poland, this is a growing industry. So I think there are not many specialized, academia persons that specialize in game design. So I'm a bit of both worlds. So. So tell me, how it works with you? How do you? What are your experiences with academia and with teaching game design, or maybe researching game design? How it works in the part of worlds where you're stationed, and I don't know, maybe Sharang. Could you?
Sure, I'll start because I think my experience will be a little bit different from Clara's and Erin's, right? Because I've seen Clara's class, for example, right? Clara and Erin's students tend to be students who are like, I want to do game design. Where I've taught, so when I taught at the International Center of Photography, their philosophy is that we bring in a teaching fellow who will teach our students an art form that is not photography to make them broaden their experience, right? So I teach students who are deliberately that this is going to be new for you and this will help in another art form, right? So that's kind of wild, where they're just like, I didn't know game is this, right? And that's interesting. And then my Fordham students, for the most part, the computer science department doesn't have a lot of video game stuff, so I teach an intro to video game design class, and they're either computer scientists who are, oh, let me see a little about video games, or their students are like, oh, I need a credit in this particular thing to graduate. Oh, this looks like a fun class. Let me just take this video game design class, right? So most of my students know little, very little about games. And even the ones who know about games are like, oh, I play League of Legends, right? I'm not denigrating League of Legends. I'm just saying they play very mainstream sort of things that are very, very big. Like many of my students, even if I say a game like The Witcher, like you've worked in Artur, many of them would be like, I have no idea what that is, right? And so my experience has actually been really delightful because at some level, I mean, I'm not gonna say they have no biases. Everyone has biases, but their biases are different from gamers, right? And I'm like, great, we're gonna start with these indie random games, and they don't think they're indie and random because they know nothing about games apart from mobile games that are like very popular, right? So it's been really interesting talking to I want to use the word naive, but not in a denigrating way, just like naive students about like the games industry, and I focus a lot on games as an art form and the socio-political effects of having games, just like of having art. And I've also been very fortunate in that all the faculties I've taught at have been very much like, we have no idea what games are and what you're doing, so do whatever you want. And I'm like, sure. So that's been really cool.
Clara, how it works with you?
I think, yeah, I think that, having done this for a while already, I think that Chirag said, put his finger on it. It's very different to teach students who are taking a game design class or a game analysis class because, they need the credit, or like, oh, they play video games. Before my current job at New York University, I was at MIT. I was teaching engineers, and they would come to my class, thinking that, they had a very high, gamer score at the Xbox. So that was going to be automated, A. And I had to say this at the beginning of the semester. It's like, I don't care about your gamer score. This is not what this class is about. So, and I had somebody walk out of my class when I said that. It was like they quit the class in the first day.
Yes,
you'd imagine MIT students are used to rigorous curricula.
Yeah, no, but it's like, because there were also humanities classes, so I think that that's one thing, that because I've never taught game design and game development in even though I've studied and worked at institutes of technology, I've always been in the humanities department. So is it kind of like harder, to actually, like convince people that, like the study of games, when you're in the humanities, it's kind of like a struggle at times. But now that I teach, in a game design department at NYU, yeah, it's much easier, if there are people who want to do this for a living, who know their games, who have a literacy of games, although at times they come to us with like mainstream tastes, but a lot of the students who get in, it's an art school. Our approach is more of an art school. So that's why, like the professors are also active, as game designers and developers. So yeah, it's a bit different, and the attitude is different. The literacy is different. But also, like, I think that one of the biases, I was just taking notes. One of the biases of this panel here, can you hear me? Because I'm seeing that I might be disconnected. One of the biases of this panel is actually that we're all into narrative games, like RPGs and interactive fiction, and it's kind of like, we're not, the norm. It's true that we have more and more students who are interested in narrative games. So it's kind of important that we acknowledge the bias of this panel. Because a lot of students who go and study games, and many of the ways in which we teach game design, the idea of like, player-centered design, iterative design, which for narrative games can be a bit tricky. So it's kind of like they might take all their class and teach approach to game design, but when it comes to narrative games specifically, or teaching game writing, like we have other obstacles, to deal with. So I think that's, like I see more and more students who are interested in games and story-driven games. But it's also like not the norm. I mean, I also come, as I said before, I got my PhD in digital media in Georgia Tech, and I studied games, but in my previous life before getting my PhD, I was studying theater. So I was used to, I would study something and be part of making it too. So if I was in the theater company when I was studying theater, if I was going to study games, I was also going to get my hands dirty. I was also in programs that encouraged me to make stuff. I think like Aaron's program, right? We shared, actually one of our faculty members, Michael Matias, was our teacher. So it's like we are like very much hands-on, and that the skills and dealing with with students, but also leading student teams to teach and to make games in academia is what gave me the experience to now go into the industry and be a consultant and write for games and do story development and things like those.
Yeah, and something you said, Clara, touched on what I was going to mention too, which was so going through a graduate program, I sort of got to see these two very different sides of games at my university. So the sort of graduate experience and the undergraduate experience. So in the time I was at Santa Cruz, game design went from like a brand new program to the largest major on campus. So it just grew like explosively. And faculty were trying to figure out, like how do we accommodate like 600 students in this major, right? And there were a lot of questions to Claire's point about like, what's the best way to set students up who are going through this major, because we weren't a trade college, right? Like at a trade school, you were just like, okay, here's a class on Photoshop, here's a class on coding, right? We're going to give you like the set of skills you need to get a career in this field. As a public and research university, there's more a sense of like, well, we want to be engaging with games as a medium and talking about theory and more than just the sort of skills you need. But there's sort of then the practical element of like a student graduating with this major is going to want to find a job. So how can you set them up for that? So lots of discussions about how can you structure a class to get, to meet both of those requirements. And, again, students with all kinds of backgrounds, from, diehard gamers who have, wanted to do this ever since they were 5 years old to, people who noticed that the game design class fulfilled like an elective, right? But they don't really have any inherent interest in it as an art form. So there was that whole experience. And then almost completely different was my experience as a graduate student, where, as opposed to like a 10-week sprint to try to make a game at the end of the quarter, right, with your team or whatever, it's like, yeah, you might have a couple years to like work on a really deep, challenging problem with a small group of people, and, very little focus on sort of the practical outcome in the traditional sense, right, of is this going to be commercially viable? Is this going to be even something that other people would want to play or interact with? It's more like, what's the theory you're advancing, and how are you going to do something to, prove out that theory? So it was really interesting to get, and I think, most people who go through grad programs have that experience, right? But two sort of like very different ways that games within academia can sort of connect. So
Erin, so I've read your dissertation, and I didn't realize that your expectation was both to do a dissertation and a big game project as well.
Well, so that was my personal expectation for myself.
Oh, okay. Because
So
it was a sizable dissertation. I'm like, you also had to make a game.
yeah, so part of my background for everyone else is I had been an indie game designer before going back to grad school, and it was really important to me that I wanted to keep making work while I was in grad school. I didn't want to sort of like fully retreat from the world of like releasing things and getting reviews and critical feedback and all that stuff, because I wanted to stay in those conversations. So that was kind of the challenge I set myself, was I'm going to do this theoretical work, but also for each of these points, I want to actually make a game and release it and sort of, do a proof by existence of the concept that I was exploring. But yes, that obviously created a lot more work for myself that I didn't, strictly speaking, need to do. But for my personal process, it was really important to, to keep things grounded in the practical. And I mean, I think that's also something everyone on this panel shares too, right? It's like none of us are pure theoreticians. We all, make stuff and put it out there. So.
Yeah. I think that my approach is mostly practical, because my main job is to make games, and I flirt with academia, and I have very different experiences, because for the last 12 years I've been teaching on a technical university, and this is a course for engineers and digital artists who are making a game. So I'm helping them with the whole design process of this small part of game they are making. So this is a very hands-on and practical experience, and it's not about games as art, but about the process of making games, the production, the communicating with players. So very hands-on and down to earth approach. And at the same time, I had the occasion to teach people who just want to enter the industry. So this is, as Sharang, you said, this people who are curious but don't know what to expect. And my role is just to give them a small, brief onboarding on what making games is all about, how it works, how the industry works in Poland and stuff like this. And I also, from time to time, I teach on a film school and presenting games as art form for filmmakers. And we can compare how making movies or TV series, how what they have in common in making games, where are the differences. So this is more like theoretical and games as art approach. But I do this only as my side job, and over the last 12 years, I have this exciting opportunity of seeing the game academia in Poland growing, because when I started, there was no industry in Poland and there were no teachers because nobody had any idea how to teach about games. And now I have some friends who made their PhDs based on games that I worked on, and I still didn't find it in myself to pursue like this academic part. But they are very good specialists, and we start having very good game research centers, and also this one university that teaches about the art of games, the theory of games, and the practical part of making games, both board games and video games. So in Poland, this is quite an interesting and growing industry. So the academia is trying to catch up and meet the demand for new designers or programmers or people who just are interested in games as art form. So I think this maybe opens the next questions. What is your opinion? Why the industry needs academia and why the academia needs the industry? What are the what is the gain, and yeah, how those two entities stand against each other? So what do you think?
I could talk for like the next 2 hours on this, but I'll keep it brief. Yeah, I think
32 minutes. So
yeah, I think that there is a kind of like symbiotic, and it's like I think that there is academic work that should be independent of the industry, that is exploratory, that is kind of like synthesizing, but also kind of like looking into the future. And that's one thing that academia can have that space, through research. Is like, where are games going? Because when we have, my students and my undergraduate students, they have 4 years. The games industry changes so much that when they enter the degree, this industry is going to be completely different when they're out. So as an instructor, I have to look ahead. It's like, where are games going? What is it that I'm going to teach? I think that the main thing, and I think that Erin already mentioned this, that there's the kind of difference between like the research institutions and this idea that you have that space for experimenting, for failing. I think that this is also one thing that we can do in academia. Making bad games is great, as long as you don't lose like tons of money to somebody else and then they kick you out. But versus the kind of like, and it's also like teaching like soft skills and approaches, like for example, I teach informal book about to this day because it teaches the kind of foundations of narrative design that I want to get across, but it's not something that is kind of industry ready. That's what the trade school would probably do. The trade schools that teach skills so that you can get a job right away, supposedly. But in a way, like, I think that for me, teaching this kind of like long-term approaches and strategies to, you know, when new tools come in, you can pick them up. It's the less focus on the tools and more about like the general concepts of design, right? You know, but I think that that's part of that kind of symbiotic, you know, thing. I think that the industry, you know, needs academia as a kind of like space to learn to synthesize like, it's a very busy industry, so you don't really have the time to think about your own practice. So having, you know, taking that distance, either as a practitioner who goes to academia or someone who reads what academics are doing, can be a good thing. But there's also, like, I think that at times academia, you know, in that kind of isolation, kind of like loses sight of what is might be important. There's also academics that, you know, I've seen this too often, that justify their hours and hours of playing something to write papers and dissertations, and it's a kind of recurring program. And you know, like I've had to evaluate you know, paper submissions to conferences where I was just like, so what? I don't care about this. You're just playing a lot of these games, but I'm not learning anything from this. So I think that this kind of like the grounding, you know, it's a bit of like a yin and yang, where, you know, there are spaces for academia and the industry to kind of be independent, and the other, you know, where they kind of, and that's where we all are here. It's like, that's the fun. This is what we're in, that kind of like mess of trying to reconcile both. But I think I wanted to just bring back something that Arthur you just mentioned before, and it's like, for those of us who's been doing this for longest, you know, we've had to invent our syllabi. We've had to invent what to teach. You know, part of what we do in academia is like figuring out, so what is it that we do? Because, you know, like when I learned how to, you know, make adventure games in university, but then I had to teach it. I'm like, wait, what do I teach now? Right. And it's like that kind of space, and like trying to break things down that we can do as academics, that at times is not as easy when you're actually, you know, in the middle of things and making commercial games, for example, or indie games.
Yeah, and I think, as you know, to really understand something, you have to teach it, right? Like, the process of doing that has taught me a ton as a designer, right? About, you know, what works, what doesn't, what are the important things that have happened in this, you know, particular medium, whatever, right? So that, coming back to the craft side, I think is always a super useful way to get a more grounded, more deeper understanding of something.
I think that and this is true for a lot of things. There's like a fundamental problem, there's a fundamental tension in any creative industry, right? In fact, you can even argue that creative industry is a contradiction in terms in some sense, right? Because you want to be creative, but you also want to make money. I mean, we talk about the film industry all the time about that, right? And I remember my partner is a filmmaker, and I was talking to him once, I'm like, hey, do you want to like submit to film journals? And he's like, there is zero benefit to me to ever do that. I'm like, why? And he's like, because I'm a filmmaker. And I'm like, do filmmakers ever read film theory journals? He's like, no, never, right? And that's the same thing. It seems to be like we have interesting ideas coming in one end, but written for whom, right? We talk about this in academia all the time, right? But in these spaces where we're working, I think it's a bigger thing, because we have all these programs where people like, we're going to study all this game and theory stuff, and then some of them become academics, and the industry doesn't mesh at all. While if the two were more enmeshed, I think so many cool things could happen, right? You could be taking time to look at interesting theory that's coming out, or theoreticians can be looking actually at, well, how do video game developers actually work and make these things that I then spend time theorizing about, right? And I think, I know this is probably a dead horse that I'm beating, right? I'm a new person in this field, a newer person in academia, but if the question is, how can the two work together? I mean, they can work together a lot more, but unfortunately, and this is especially true in the video game industry, where video game design professionals are not treated very well by many companies. I always tell my students, I'm like, hey, which of you want to go into video game design? Great, you need to be aware of this, especially because you're a minority woman, for example, right? And if there were a lot fewer things like crunch and stuff, maybe that would give designers more time to read Aaron's dissertation on expressive input, for example, right? And be like, oh, that's an interesting thought. Maybe I should incorporate that into my game. Or it would give theoreticians like, oh, let me actually talk to Artur, who worked on the Witcher game, as a primary source for a theory that I'm developing, and not just like come up with stuff out of my butt, right? So could the two be more enmeshed? Yes. Which is why maybe it's a good thing that that the people on this panel are sort of in both worlds, right? We make stuff. Archer, you're much more in the mainstream industry than I think the rest of us are, having worked with like CD Projekt Red and stuff. Though I know that Clara has done a very wide set of things. But I think all of us here straddle that, and I think that's great, right? It stops us from being siloed in one way or the other, I think.
But it also,
excuse me. Yeah, go ahead, Claire. Sorry.
No, it's just that, just very briefly, it's like it also makes it really hard to put us in a box, you know, because we straddle, and you know, both the industry and academia loves people put it into boxes and like a label. And you're an academic that makes things. It's like that doesn't compute. You should just write papers. And if you're in the industry and you're also an academic, you're like, but how can you do both? So I'm happy in this space, but it's true that that's not always the easiest thing to do.
Challenging, yeah.
Yeah, and I was just, following up on that, gonna say that yeah, it's there's a big problem of, the value systems of each of those worlds, industry and academia, having totally different goals and objectives, right? So like if I, as an academic, publish a paper at a conference, no one in the game industry will read that, and those ideas will not propagate to anyone in the game industry. But if I put up a blog post about the same thing, and I'm trying to get tenure, my tenure committee is not going to recognize that as a meaningful contribution to the theory of games, right? So I think that's a huge problem, is how can we create support structures within academia to reward making that knowledge accessible and useful to people in industry, and how can we find ways of convincing industry that there might be useful things in academia that they can learn from, right? So yeah, it's a big problem and a big frustration with me for games academia, actually. So
yeah, I think that I feel that there is a tension between the industry and the academia, and some of it is very practical, because the industry, like, just like speaking without any, just very frankly, just needs new workers, just needs new people who can do stuff. And when you talk with the bosses or the people who decide how the industry is run, they are usually interesting. No, yeah, they are usually interested in cooperating with the academia to get new designers, new programmers, new artists, and basically that's it. On the other hand, the academia, I think, needs games to research them, to write about them, and as Clara, you said this, to tell us game designers what are we actually doing and why is it important. And I'm a huge fan of this, because I find real joy in seeing that games are more and more part of the mainstream culture, and they are analyzed and researched and written about, just as books are or movies are, because this also creates this feedback loop that we expect more things from the game industry. Just for many years in the industry, it was like, oh, treat us like art. Games are art. Treat us as adults. And now the world and the culture says, yes, okay, yeah, we see that. Games are art. So please create art, apart from making great products. And this is very exciting when you work in the industry. And Aaron, what you said about blogs versus publications, and my contacts with the academia is more like network based. Both my friends working in the academia and me, we work sort of against our best interest to stay in touch, because it would be more out there more money focusing only on making games, and they really have to work around the rigid structures of the academia to hire me or to contact other people who actually work on games. But I think it's worth it. Both sides want to put the effort, because I think it leads to something, to new approaches, and sometimes, because I'm not an academic, like not a researcher, so sometimes I just when I think I have an idea about how something works, or why something is designed the way it is designed, I put it out as a blog post, or just talk to my friends in the academia, hoping they will take it and base some research on it, and maybe come back to me with some wider approach, or something that is not only this craft. And yeah, because the experience I had is that teaching people about how to design games helped me to be better at designing games, because I had to understand, not I already could do this, but now I had to understand why I'm doing this in such a way, or why I'm making such choices. It was very enlightening experience, but usually I don't have time for this. I just have a deadline to meet, and so that's quite an interesting dynamics.
I want to add a bit to that. I think that Sharon already mentioned this, like because you're crunching, you don't have time to really think. I think that that's one of the problems in the industry. And I think that's also one of the problems, one of the reasons when the industry comes to us looking for people to work in new games is because people get burnt out. So I think that that's important also to teach. And that's why, at least being a bit selfish, the approach of the art school of being kind of like entrepreneurial game designer, but also being somebody who is adaptable and can learn and can move and can keep making things. Because I think that one of the things that we can do from academia is also teaching not only management. I'm currently teaching a class on game development where managing and Scrum and Agile development is like part of the core and the key, but also to have like more, healthier practices, like from academia, trying to make an industry that is more diverse, that points out at the problems of the lack of diversity in video games as well, but games in general too. I don't want to leave out the non-digital space, but I think that also, like management and think of like what is possible, what is not, so that people don't burn through. Because I think that the industry relies a lot on crunch, on people, like being young and being able to work long hours. But when you hit certain ages, you're like, I want to be able to go to my home and have dinner and go to bed and sleep 8 hours, which doesn't always happen in certain parts of the industry. And I think that that's one thing that academia in the schools that teach, the game development and game design, that's something that we can do more of, preparing people, but not as a kind of like cookie cutter for the industry that as it is now, but to change the industry and to kind of evolve and have healthier practices and also a kind of more diverse, workforce.
I think that brings up a really interesting idea that's, I think, heart of a lot of the I feel issues in the American education system is what is the role of tertiary education, right? Because for a long time, the role of secondary education from the Industrial Revolution was we're going to make factory workers. That is why you go to secondary education. And tertiary education was to do something else. And now, I'm not saying we should return to that at all, right? But that was a role for a while. And now it's become more like, oh, now tertiary, a bachelor's degree is also just to train you to become a cog, right? A cog in the capitalist machine, blah, 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 right? And so that's really interesting to think about what is your role as a professor. I think Clara has a really good point. Like not only do we have to teach you tools, because many art schools woefully fail at arming you to be an adult, right? They're like, here are tools to make your art, and now somehow you will make money out of it, but we won't tell you how. Go, right? For me, I have a different question, right? Because most of my students are not going to go into game design, right? Most of them are not going to go into game design. But my undergrads probably aren't even going to go into media jobs. Many of them major in whatever, and then they take whatever job, right? So especially last year, when I was rethinking my curriculum for the fall, and the pandemic was happening, and the rise of fascism everywhere in the world, I'm like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I teaching? And so I shifted my course. I actually took out many of the design elements and started putting more like, let's talk about games and gender. Let's talk about race and games. Let's talk, and all those things, because for my students, I'm like, this is what they need, right? They're no, especially if many of them are comp sci students. Traditionally, computer science students in many schools don't grapple with as much of the humanities and don't think about those things as deeply as other science students, honestly. I found, at least in my experience, in the limited experience I have with certain American universities. I was like, I'm going to teach them a little bit about game design, not really about being a games industry professional, because that isn't useful to any of you. Plus, I know less about that anyway, because I'm a freelance analog game designer, and I make that very clear at the start of the lesson. I'm like, if you're expecting something else, I'm not that person. But I started being like, let's talk about like representation in games, kind of like what Clara said about that diversity. Let's talk about how games are influenced by other arts, and other arts are influenced by games. Let's talk about how to not only analyze games, but how can we analyze media in general, with our example being games, because that's what this class is about, right? I think so. The idea that Clara brought up is like, what is our role as academics? What is our responsibility to our students? Is a very interesting and also ever-changing one. Especially, like we mentioned, the industry of games is rapidly changing itself very, very quickly.
What you said, Sharon and Clara, it resonated strongly with me because one of the things that I started thinking about, I think, by contacts with the student and the academia, is what is our role as game designers, as far as speaking about the world is concerned, because games are very powerful tools about speaking about the world. And there's a lot of rhetorics going on in games. Every time I design a system in a game, it could be a statement about what I think about how economy works, how psychology works. And people playing the games are not aware that I'm making this rhetoric statement, because they think, oh, this is a simulation. This is how the world works. But it's not. It's always how those particular designers thought about this part of reality. So every system is a rhetorical device. And when you realize this as a game designer, it suddenly becomes your responsibility to use it wisely. This is at least how I think. And the other thing that I experienced very clearly working in the industry from Poland, so from Eastern Europe, is that this is a global industry. And if I were a Polish author, and if I was writing books in Polish, when they would be translated into English, everybody would know, oh, this is a translation of a Polish book, so this is written from a Polish perspective, and we read this as such. But when I'm making games, I'm making them mostly for the American market and the West European market, and most of the time I'm writing in English, not in Polish. So I'm working in a language that's not my language, for a culture that I may or may not understand, because it's not my culture. And when the product hits the market, it's not perceived as a game from Poland, but as a game. And this poses many interesting questions, because for historical reason, for example, Poland is a very is not a very diverse country. Where
Mm.
we are in Eastern Europe, and almost all my friends and people I know are white, because this is how history happened in this part of the world. And this calls for being very aware of what happens in the world, because the biases we have were living in any part of the world, I think, are much more visible when we are making games which are global products and will be received and experienced by people from very different backgrounds. And this is something that I think academia is helping, or could help, at least in my experience. The contact with academia, I think, made me a bit more aware about what's going on here. So
yeah, we were
yeah,
talking about preparing a syllabus earlier, right, as like an important thing you do as a professor. And I think it's not often appreciated how important that is, right? Like, and we talked about tool sets you want to give students, but there's so many more kinds of tool sets than just the technical ones, right? So like Clara was saying, like, it's a useful tool set to have to know how to manage a project and manage time, right? Like when you're choosing to cover a game and you're deciding whether you want to talk about the shaders this week or you want to talk about how that studio made its employees go through awful crunch, right? Like each of those sort of moves in choosing what you're going to cover is sort of shaping this new generation of students for what conversations they are used to having about games and how they're used to thinking about games, right? Like if you choose to cover a game from a certain country or with certain cultural perspective, right? All of those decisions, I think, are really important things that academics can do to be changing parts of the status quo that are not the best, right?
Yeah, well, there's also studying history and, like what games get covered or not, is also important. And that's one thing that what we call game studies, the kind of theory of games can do well. I believe I might have been not the one person. I taught with Bennett Foddy a class on European games of the 1980s, because that's what we grew up with those, but also like there's, plenty of game designers from Europe who played those, and that's where they come from. And not everybody grew up with Mario, not everybody learned game design with Mario, or like Zelda and all this. Like there are many different histories, and in a way, like I think that part of the sad thing is like, yes, we are in a global market, and at times learning to appreciate the national specificity, like we do, for example, in film, that's one thing that we kind of miss, and that's one thing that academia could kind of shed a light on. It's like, okay, so what are games like in China? China's a huge market. Does the rest of the world know what kinds of games? Like what is the cultural heritage that is, part of Chinese industry? We know probably about Japanese games, and we know a lot, but it's kind of like there's a book on games of Latin America, right? Like that kind of like specificity. I think that we're kind of like losing that and teaching not only game designers, but also, as academics, teaching game players and critics to appreciate that variety. And it's kind of like, okay, so this is a Polish game. What makes this Polish? Like I wrote a whole article about, okay, what are these games from Spain in the 80s? What makes them Spanish? What makes it? They were the only, like, you could tell that they're Spanish. Why? There are games that are French, and I start a French game. I'm like, I know this is French, and I more or less can tell you why, right? And I think that's part of what we're missing. Like that there is, if we talk about games as art as culture, then why aren't we looking more into like what cultures are producing those rather than for the whole world?
And one of the things, one reason sorry.
So I am smiling because my friend just got a grant to research what is a Polish game,
Yeah,
what makes
exactly.
a game Polish. So I think in a year or two, we will be able to answer you to that question. Answer that question. Sure.
I was thinking that really, I harp about this all the time, right? So for example, I have an undergraduate degree in engineering, but I went to a liberal arts school. So I have a Bachelor of Arts in Engineering, which is very weird. But, and I really believe in this liberal arts mentality, especially when it comes to, again, this artistic industry, which again, contradiction terms maybe, in that I don't feel you can become an artist of any sort if your education is almost exclusively about that art, right? Which is why the photography program I teach, I really respect them for this, right? They're like, you are all photographers, you're gonna take this weird LARP class that this weird dude is gonna teach you, and you're gonna play all these dumb games that are gonna make you play, right? I think like my partner again went to film school, and he picked Columbia instead of Tisch because he's like, as a Tisch filmmaker, you only do film, or for the most part, I'm not entirely aware of the program. While as a Columbia filmmaker, he is forced to do a lot of other things, right? And we can answer questions like, what does a culture, how does this game resonate with this culture? How do we make a game for a global audience coming from our culture? All that, I think those would become a lot easier if the people involved, if all the artists involved in making a game, and there, you know, as all of us know, many artists involved in making a mainstream commercial game, if everyone had a more broad education in humanities and arts, and again, this is me harping, I think that would make our job, that would make our industry richer and better and amazing.
Okay.
Just, you know,
We have something like 4 minutes left, and there's one interesting question on the Discord channel do you know anyone who has a PhD in game design, or is it possible to have a PhD, write a PhD in game design? How is it on? No.
There are
Experience with that.
maybe Aaron is the closest.
Yeah.
What's your PhD? Mine is in digital media.
Okay, so I got an MFA in digital media, but my PhD was in computer science because when I started that program in 2011, that was the closest thing, right, to what I wanted to do. There was a graduate research group doing exclusively interactive narrative stuff. By the time I had finished, they had actually created a new graduate program called Computational Media, and the point of that was exactly this discussion of like, we want to look at games not from the technical perspective, but from the cultural perspective, right? Like, let's look at how these are working as parts of the conversation, right? All of that kind of stuff. I had already taken all the core classes for computer science, so I didn't want to like start over and switch to that. But it's really interesting that that was 10 years ago, right? That wasn't really a thing, and it's only kind of really very recently that you've started to see on the graduate level the equivalent of like a PhD in games come to exist.
Yeah, and I feel PhDs in general, it is less frequent to have PhDs focusing on design, right? I feel those are different kinds of graduate degree. I mean, there are exceptions, like the EngD, the engineering, doctor of engineering stuff, right? But I feel that's rare. I know a number of people who have PhDs in game studies, and they're all from Scandinavia, if I can recall. But it's less, and they all of them do some design. But yeah, I think the degree programs tend to call themselves studies, or like Aaron, they're in another department, but the focus is game stuff, right? They're in like cultural media critique, and my focus was on LARP or something.
Yeah, I mean, usually the PhD programs, you have the name of the department or the program itself, and then like whatever you write your dissertation on. So that I can think of a thing again. In Scandinavia, there might be like game design departments where their programs are like PhDs in game design. But the other alternative, which I don't know if there's much of this in Europe now that I think about it. In the US, we have terminal degrees that are not PhD. So we have the Master of Fine Arts, which is wider creative writing. Yeah, creative writing programs are MFA, so they're 3 years, and that's kind of like, okay, you're the master of your craft, and that's and that's it. So in my program we have an MFA in game design, and that is a terminal degree, so that's kind of like the closest. But yeah, if it's a PhD, it's usually computational media. Mine was called digital media. Media studies. I don't know if there's even like PhDs in design, like general design are also rare. So I don't know, like
they're very rare.
Yeah, so like, I think that in game design it would be even rarer. So you need programs that are kind of like wider and can kind of cater to more people, and also to kind of evolve so that when things change, they can't keep up with them.
I think we have to wrap it up because
Oh.
our time is almost up. We can continue on the Discord channel if there are any more questions. That's to the people who hopefully are listening to us. So time to wrap it up. From my side, I must say it was a pleasure talking with you and exchanging experiences. I like this panel very much. I must say.
It was a lot of fun.
It's been really fun.
Thank you for moderating for us, Artur.
Okay,
Yes,
so
thank you. Thank you so
thank
much.
you, and hopefully see you again
Yes.
on some occasion. So bye.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.